Recently, Donald Trump has offered refugee status to white South Africans. But more surprisingly, the white South Africans have turned the proposal down.
Why would you want to go? Hasn't been any really bad taking over of land. The people are carrying on like normal. And, what are you going to do over there?
This tells everyone that while the world was dealing with real humanitarian crises, Trump was busy pushing a bizarre, baseless conspiracy that white South Africans were being persecuted by their government. But here's the real story. South Africa isn't the victim here, it's the revolution. Pretoria is taking bold steps to reclaim its land, economy, and future, and the US is panicking. Why? If South Africa succeeds, it will set a precedent that could forever shatter Western control over Africa. And Trump is desperate to stop it. But can he? Or is this the moment the global South finally breaks free? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. To fully grasp why Trump is so fixated on South Africa, it is essential to examine the Expropriation Act of 2025, a landmark policy aimed at correcting deep-rooted land inequalities resulting from centuries of colonial occupation and apartheid-era dispossession. South Africa's land crisis is not recent. It dates back to the early days of European settlement, when indigenous Africans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. This injustice intensified under apartheid, with the 1913 and 1936 Land Acts, which systematically stripped black South Africans of their land ownership rights, confining them to a mere 7% of the country's land, while white settlers, despite being a minority, controlled the vast majority of agricultural and resource-rich areas. By the time apartheid formally ended in 1994, these inequalities remained deeply entrenched. The newly democratic South African government attempted land reform through a willing buyer, willing seller policy, encouraging white landowners to voluntarily sell the land back to the state for redistribution. However, this approach was slow, inefficient, and hindered by economic interests. As a result, 3 decades after apartheid ended, white South Africans, who make up less than 10% of the population, still owned approximately 72% of private agricultural land. In response to this failure, the Expropriation Act of 2025 was introduced to allow the government to seize land in cases of public interest, with just and equitable compensation, or, in specific cases, with no compensation at all if the land is deemed to have been historically stolen or left unused. The act does not indiscriminately confiscate land from white farmers, as Trump and his allies claim. Instead, it provides a legal framework to accelerate land reform while ensuring that South Africa's economy remains stable. However, because this policy challenges the Western economic model of land ownership and resource control, it has been met with fierce opposition from the US and its corporate backers. Trump and right-wing media in the United States have seized on South Africa's land reform as part of a broader ideological war against racial justice movements worldwide. By distorting the Expropriation Act into a narrative of white victimhood, Trump has successfully weaponized the land issue to rally his conservative base, which sees land reform as an extension of the anti-DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion movement in America. Elon Musk, a South African-born billionaire with deep economic ties to Western corporate interests, has also contributed to this disinformation campaign, claiming that the South African government is targeting white farmers for racial reasons. This narrative is entirely false. The South African government has repeatedly assured that land reform will be carried out lawfully, with due process and a focus on reversing centuries of land theft, not racially motivated land grabs. But why does Trump care so much? The truth is he doesn't, at least not in the way he claims. His outrage is not about human rights, fairness, or democracy, but about protecting US corporate and financial interests in South Africa. Many American and European multinational corporations have long held stakes in South Africa's agricultural and mining industries, benefiting from cheap labor and land access. If Pretoria succeeds in redistributing land fairly, it threatens the economic model that has allowed Western businesses to extract wealth from Africa while keeping local populations in poverty. Beyond economic concerns, Trump and the broader Western establishment fear the domino effect that successful land reform in South Africa could trigger across the African continent. South Africa, as one of Africa's largest economies and a key player in BRICS, serves as a model for other African nations seeking to reclaim their sovereignty from Western-backed economic structures. If land reform in South Africa proves successful, it will embolden other African nations to implement similar policies, directly undermining US and European economic dominance on the continent. Countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Kenya have already signaled their interest in redistributing land that was stolen during colonial rule. If South Africa sets a precedent for sustainable and just land redistribution, the West risks losing control over Africa's resources, from agriculture to mining sectors that fuel global industries. This is what terrifies Trump, Western elites, and multinational corporations. The Expropriation Act is not just about land, it is about power shifting away from the global north and back into the hands of African nations. Washington, London, and Brussels have thrived on an economic model where African land and resources are controlled by foreign entities. Pretoria's defiance threatens to dismantle this system, and that is why Trump is so desperate to manufacture a crisis around it. If South Africa follows through with its land reform successfully, it will demonstrate that African nations can break free from Western economic control and thrive on their terms. This moment is bigger than Trump, bigger than Musk, and bigger than South Africa alone. It is about Africa reclaiming what was stolen and reshaping the global economic order. And how far can Trump go to stop South Africa? Trump's rhetoric against South Africa has not just been empty political posturing. His administration has taken deliberate, aggressive steps to weaken Pretoria, both economically and diplomatically. The strategy, which can only be described as economic warfare, is a calculated attempt to sabotage South Africa's sovereignty by leveraging US financial dominance. The first major move in this strategy came when Trump signed an executive order cutting financial aid to South Africa, directly targeting programs that had long been essential for development. The US has historically provided significant financial support to South Africa, particularly through aid programs in health, trade, and education. One of the most critical areas affected by these cuts is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief (PEPFAR), which provides life-saving HIV/AIDS medication to millions of South Africans. The withdrawal of these funds could have devastating consequences for South Africa's public health sector. But Trump's actions did not stop at cutting aid. His administration pressured international institutions, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), to reduce funding and investment projects in South Africa. The logic behind this move is clear. By creating economic uncertainty, the US hopes to weaken investor confidence in South Africa's economy. Western-backed financial institutions have long been tools of economic control, offering financial assistance to developing nations only under conditions that align with US interests. South Africa's decision to assert its own financial independence and challenge Western-controlled economic models has made it a target of Trump's economic retaliation. Perhaps the most outrageous move was Trump's offer of refugee status to white South Africans, a blatant attempt to fuel racial tensions and create an international crisis around a false narrative. In early 2025, Trump signed an executive order claiming that white South Africans face government persecution due to land reforms. Despite repeated denials from Pretoria that land redistribution efforts were race-based, the offer was a direct political stunt, playing into the same far-right conspiracy theories that have been peddled by white nationalist groups in the US and Europe. The refugee status program was nothing more than an attempt to delegitimize South Africa's land policies, painting the government as racially oppressive while simultaneously undermining the legitimacy of Black South Africans' fight for land justice. But how did the white South Africans react to this? When Donald Trump signed an executive order in early 2025, offering refugee status to white South Africans, he may have expected a wave of Afrikaners eager to flee to the United States. Instead, what he got was a collective shrug, some amusement, and even outright rejection from the very people he claimed to be rescuing. For Trump, the narrative of white persecution in South Africa fits neatly into his broader right-wing, anti-DEI agenda, allowing him to frame himself as a savior of Afrikaners supposedly under attack by the South African government's land reform policies. The executive order cited unjust racial discrimination against white farmers, alleging that land expropriation was targeting them specifically. Yet the response from Afrikaners was far from what Trump had hoped for. Instead of rushing to pack their bags, many Afrikaners dismissed Trump's offer as unnecessary, out of touch, or even offensive. For some, the notion that they were victims in need of rescue was not just inaccurate, but demeaning. A 78-year-old pensioner living in Bothasig near Cape Town was blunt in his response, saying that there haven't been any really bad people taking over our land, the people are carrying on like normal. What are you going to do over there? Many white South Africans simply did not see themselves as refugees in need of resettlement. Despite concerns over land reform, they were not experiencing violent expropriation or government persecution in the way Trump and his allies claimed. Instead of fleeing, many Afrikaners emphasized their commitment to staying and fighting for their rights within South Africa. Right-wing Afrikaner lobby groups, often cited as Trump's primary sources when he talks about South Africa, also rejected the idea of mass emigration. For these people, leaving South Africa would mean abandoning their cultural and historical identity, something they were unwilling to do. The Solidarity Movement, an umbrella group representing over 600,000 Afrikaner families and 2 million individuals, said, "We may disagree with the ANC, but we love our country." As in any community, some individuals wish to emigrate, but repatriation of Afrikaners as refugees is not a solution for us. Trump's failed attempt to position himself as a white savior for South Africa's Afrikaner population quickly turned into an embarrassment. The rejection of Trump's refugee offer completely undermined his claims that white South Africans were victims of a racial purge. If land expropriation was as catastrophic as he suggested, why weren't white South Africans fleeing in droves? The simple answer is that Trump was fabricating a crisis, and even those he claimed to be saving didn't buy into it. By attempting to insert himself into South Africa's land reform debate, Trump not only embarrassed himself diplomatically, but also exposed the hollowness of his rhetoric. Instead of being hailed as a protector of white South Africans, he was left looking out of touch and uninformed, pushing a narrative that even its supposed beneficiaries rejected. At the end of the day, South Africa's land reform remains a complex but necessary process of historical correction. And while Trump and his allies continue to push propaganda about white victimhood, even the very people he claims to be saving are telling him, no thanks. So we know Trump's allegations are baseless. Then what is he trying to achieve? Trump's weaponization of financial aid, international institutions, and diplomatic pressure follows a well-documented pattern of U.S. intervention. For decades, Washington has used economic power not just as a tool of influence, but as a weapon to force compliance. From Latin America to the Middle East, the U.S. has imposed economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial blockades against nations that refuse to align with its foreign policy agenda. In Africa, this tactic has been used repeatedly to undermine governments that seek independence from Western financial control. The U.S. played a direct role in destabilizing Zimbabwe's economy after former President Robert Mugabe implemented land reform policies that redistributed land from white settlers to black Zimbabweans. Economic sanctions crippled Zimbabwe's financial system, leading to hyperinflation and economic collapse, which was later used as a cautionary tale to scare other African nations away from implementing similar reforms. The same playbook is now being used against South Africa, but Pretoria is far better positioned to resist. What Trump and his allies failed to anticipate is that South Africa is no longer dependent on the United States for its financial stability. The country has been actively working toward economic independence through its partnerships with China, Russia, and other BRICS nations, a move that has significantly reduced its reliance on Western-controlled financial systems. By the time Trump decided to cut aid and pressure financial institutions, South Africa had already forged stronger economic alliances that allowed it to withstand Western pressure. BRICS has been actively working on alternative financial mechanisms, including a BRICS Development Bank that provides funding to member states without the strict political conditions imposed by the IMF or World Bank. Additionally, South Africa has strengthened its trade agreements with China, which has invested billions into South Africa's infrastructure, energy, and mining industries. The U.S. cutting aid and attempting to isolate South Africa financially is not having the intended effect. Instead, it is pushing South Africa further into the BRICS economic system, accelerating the very shift away from Western economic control that Washington was trying to prevent. Pretoria's ability to maintain its economic stability despite U.S. pressure is a significant blow to Washington's influence, proving that nations no longer need to depend on the U.S. to thrive. Trump's economic warfare against South Africa is not just an attack on one nation, it is an attempt to stop a larger geopolitical shift. South Africa's success in resisting U.S. economic pressure sets an example for other African nations, proving that they too can reject Western financial dominance and build independent economic systems. Instead of bringing Pretoria to its knees, Trump's tactics are backfiring spectacularly. His boycott of the G20 meeting in South Africa, his executive orders, and his financial restrictions are being seen not as displays of strength, but as signs of desperation. The United States, once the unquestioned global superpower, is now resorting to economic blackmail to maintain its grip on nations that no longer wish to be controlled. South Africa is standing firm, and as it continues to develop its economic alliances outside of U.S. influence, Washington is quickly learning that its days of dictating African policy are coming to an end. If South Africa thrives despite these attacks, other nations will follow suit, and Trump's aggressive economic warfare will only serve to accelerate the decline of Western control over Africa. The question now is not whether the U.S. will continue to pressure South Africa, but whether Washington will eventually be forced to accept that Africa is no longer under its control. So, in the end, Donald Trump's attempt to weaponize South Africa's land reform as a political tool has backfired spectacularly. His economic warfare, diplomatic boycotts, and manufactured white victimhood narratives have not only failed to stop Pretoria's policies, but have also further isolated the United States on the global stage. By cutting aid, pressuring financial institutions, and offering refugee status to white South Africans, Trump sought to destabilize South Africa's economy and create international outrage. Instead, he has pushed South Africa even closer to BRICS nations, accelerating its economic realignment away from Western control. His attempt to paint Afrikaners as persecuted refugees was equally disastrous. White South Africans, including their right-wing organizations, publicly rejected his offer, exposing the falsehood behind his claims. More importantly, Trump's obsession with South Africa is not really about South Africa. It is about controlling Africa as a whole. Pretoria's ability to resist U.S. pressure and reclaim control over its land and economy is a direct threat to the Western economic model that has dominated Africa for centuries. If South Africa succeeds, other African nations will follow, breaking free from the financial grip of Washington, London, and Brussels. At its core, Trump's battle against South Africa is not about justice, democracy, or human rights. It is about desperation. The U.S. is losing its ability to dictate Africa's future, and South Africa's defiance has become a symbol of a new world order emerging, one where African nations refuse to bow to Western pressure. The question is no longer whether Trump can stop South Africa. He already failed. The real question is, how many other nations will follow Pretoria's lead, reclaim their sovereignty, and permanently dismantle Western dominance in Africa? Do you think Trump is trying to play a game? Will he succeed? Let us know in the comment section. For whom he is doing all this? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.